"You're dead to us." My father Orion's words cut through the Christmas dinner like a blade, silencing the entire table. The crystal glasses trembled. My mother nodded in agreement, her face cold as winter stone. My siblings stared down at their plates, too cowardly to meet my eyes. I smiled calmly, pulled out my phone, and made one simple call that would change everything. 24 hours later, my family's world came crashing down when my supervisor called them directly. You see, they had no idea that their disappointment of a daughter was actually the one person keeping their entire lives from falling apart. What happens when the family scapegoat you've spent years tearing down turns out to be the very foundation holding up your house of lies? My name is Alessandra Korrin, and this is the story of how one Christmas dinner destroyed my family's perfect facade forever. Because sometimes, the person you underestimate the most is the one with the power to expose who you really are. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. You're dead to us. The words fell from my father Orion's lips like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock across the mahogany dining table. The Christmas dinner that had been filled with forced laughter and strained pleasantries just moments before now sat in absolute silence. The turkey grew cold, the cranberry sauce congealed, and the expensive wine my mother Silwyn had insisted on serving seemed to turn bitter in everyone's mouth. I sat there, fork halfway to my lips, watching as my entire family stared at me with a mixture of disgust, disappointment, and something that looked almost like relief. Relief that they could finally say what they'd been thinking all along. My younger brother Conan shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his designer sweater suddenly seeming too tight around his neck. My sister Mira avoided eye contact altogether, suddenly fascinated by the pattern on her dinner plate. The Christmas lights twinkled mockingly from the corner where their perfectly decorated tree stood, laden with ornaments that cost more than most people's monthly rent. This was supposed to be the Korrin family's annual celebration at their estate in Thornbrook Heights, the kind of dinner that would later be posted on social media with captions about blessed family time and grateful hearts. Instead, it had become the moment everything finally fell apart. "Did you hear me, Alessandra?" My father continued, his voice growing louder, more confident now that he'd crossed the line. "You're not welcome here anymore. After what you've done, after the embarrassment you've brought to this family, I want you gone. Tonight." My mother nodded silently, her perfectly manicured hands folded in her lap like she was sitting in church instead of destroying her eldest daughter's life. She'd always been good at staying quiet while others did her dirty work. Even my grandmother, seated at the head of the table in the chair that used to belong to my grandfather, said nothing in my defense. I set my fork down carefully, the small clink against the china plate sounding unnaturally loud in the hushed room. 28 years old, and I was being disowned at a Christmas dinner because I'd finally stood up for myself. Because I'd finally refused to be their convenient scapegoat for every family drama, every business failure, every social embarrassment that came their way. "You're serious about this," I said quietly, not a question, but a statement. My voice was steadier than I felt inside, where something was breaking apart and reforming into something harder, sharper. "Deadly serious," Orion replied, puffing out his chest like he was delivering some grand pronouncement. "We've carried you long enough. Your constant drama, your inability to fit in with decent society, your complete lack of appreciation for everything we've given you. We're done." That's when I smiled. Not a bitter smile, not a sarcastic smirk, but a genuine, almost peaceful smile that seemed to confuse everyone at the table. I reached into my purse, pulled out my phone, and scrolled through my contacts until I found the one I was looking for. Without breaking eye contact with my father, I hit the call button and put the phone on speaker. The room held its breath as the phone rang once, twice, 3 times. "Alessandra, this is unexpected." Is everything all right? The voice that answered was crisp, professional, and carried the kind of authority that made people sit up straighter without thinking about it. "Hello, Director Chen," I said calmly, still maintaining that unsettling smile. "I'm sorry to bother you on Christmas evening, but I'm having a family situation that I think you should be aware of." I watched as the color slowly drained from my father's face. My mother's perfectly composed expression cracked just slightly around the edges. Conan's mouth fell open, and Mira finally looked up from her plate, her eyes wide with confusion and the first stirrings of fear. "Of course, Director," Chen replied. "What can I do for you?" "Well, I've just been disowned by my family," I said conversationally, as if I were discussing the weather. "They've asked me to leave and never come back. I wanted to make sure this wouldn't affect any of the ongoing investigations or security clearances, given that they're all listed as my emergency contacts and character references." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear Director Chen's sharp intake of breath through the phone, and I could practically feel my family's growing panic as they began to understand that maybe, just maybe, they didn't know their disappointment daughter quite as well as they thought they did. "Alessandra." Director Chen's voice had taken on a different quality now, something protective and slightly dangerous. "Can you clarify what you mean by disowned? Are we talking about a family disagreement or something more serious?" Before I could answer, my father found his voice again, though it sounded much less confident than it had moments before. "Who is that? What investigations? Alessandra, what have you done?" I ignored him completely, keeping my attention on the phone call. "My father just told me I'm dead to them and that I need to leave their house immediately. They've made it clear that I'm no longer considered part of this family." "I see." The temperature in Director Chen's voice dropped several degrees. "And this is happening at a family gathering on Christmas Day." "That's correct." "Alessandra, put me on with whoever is the head of household, please." My smile widened as I slid the phone across the table toward my father, whose hands were now visibly shaking. "Director Chen would like to speak with you, Dad." Orion stared at the phone like it might bite him. "I don't understand what's happening here. Who is Director Chen? What does this have to do with us?" "Pick up the phone," I said quietly, my voice carrying a note of steel that I'd never used with my family before. "He's waiting." With trembling fingers, my father lifted the phone. "This is Alessandra Korrin. I don't know who you are or what my daughter has told you, but this is a private family matter." "Mr. Korrin, this is Director Chen from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Your daughter works for us." The phone slipped from my father's nerveless fingers, clattering against his dinner plate. The sound echoed through the dining room like a gunshot, and I watched as my entire family's world shifted on its axis. Everything they thought they knew about me, every assumption they'd made about my life, every cruel joke they'd made about my meaningless government job, suddenly took on a very different meaning. My mother's wine glass slipped from her hand, red wine spreading across the white tablecloth like blood. Conan made a sound that might have been a whimper. Mira had gone completely pale, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. I picked up the phone, taking it off speaker mode. "I'm here, Director." "Alessandra, I need you to listen carefully. Do you feel safe where you are right now?" Looked around the table at my family, who were all staring at me like I'd just grown a second head. For the first time in my life, I was the one with the power in this room, and it felt intoxicating. "I'm perfectly safe," I said. "Just experiencing some family dysfunction. Nothing I can't handle." "Are you certain?" "Because I can have agents there, in 20 minutes if needed." The way my father's face went from pale to green at the mention of federal agents was almost comical. "That won't be necessary, but I appreciate the concern." "All right. Take tomorrow off, and I'll see you in my office first thing Tuesday morning. We need to discuss updating your emergency contacts and security references. Clearly, some changes need to be made." "Understood." Thank you, Director. And Alessandra, Merry Christmas. You deserve better than this. I hung up the phone and slipped it back into my purse, taking a moment to savor the complete and utter silence that had fallen over the Korrin family Christmas dinner. The same family who had spent years treating me like their personal disappointment, their convenient target for every frustration and failure, now sat frozen in their chairs, finally beginning to understand just how wrong they'd been about everything. So, I said pleasantly, standing up and smoothing down my dress, I believe you wanted me to leave. My name is Alessandra Korrin, and until 30 minutes ago, my family thought I was a failure. For 28 years, I've been the family disappointment, the one who couldn't quite measure up to their impossible standards. The daughter who took a boring government job, instead of joining the family's prestigious law firm, or marrying into another wealthy Thornbrook Heights family like they'd planned. What they didn't know, what they had never bothered to ask about, was exactly what that boring government job entailed. While they assumed I was some low-level paper pusher counting down the days until retirement, I was actually one of the FBI's youngest senior special agents, specializing in white-collar, crime and financial fraud. While they made jokes about my meaningless career at dinner parties, I was leading investigations that had put some of the most dangerous criminals in the country behind bars. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But that wasn't even the most ironic part. The most ironic part was that for the past 3 years, I had been the invisible guardian angel keeping the Korrin family name from being dragged through the mud of a federal investigation. You see, my family's law firm, Korrin, Stradal and Associates, wasn't quite as clean as their marble floors and mahogany conference tables suggested. My father, the founding partner, had been cutting corners for years, taking shortcuts that weren't exactly legal, making deals with clients that weren't exactly ethical. Nothing major, nothing that would land him in federal prison, but enough violations to destroy their reputation and possibly result in disbarment if the wrong people started asking the right questions. And those wrong people had been asking those questions for the better part of 2 years. It started with a routine audit of one of their biggest clients, Meridian Holdings, a real estate development company that had been making some questionable transactions. When the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit started digging into Meridian's books, they found connections to several other companies, including some that had retained Korrin, Stradal and Associates for legal services that skirted the edge of money laundering laws. The case landed on my desk by pure coincidence. I was reviewing the files when I saw my own family name in the documents, saw my father's signature on papers that would have raised red flags for any competent federal agent. My stomach had dropped to my shoes as I realized that my family's prestigious law firm was about to become the center of a major federal investigation. That's when I made the decision that would define the next 3 years of my life. Instead of recusing myself from the case, which would have been the ethical thing to do, I volunteered to lead the investigation. I told my supervisor that my family connections would give me insider access that could be valuable to the case. What I didn't tell him was that I planned to use that access to protect my family, even though they'd spent my entire life treating me like garbage. For 3 years, I had been walking a tightrope that would have destroyed my career if anyone had found out. I fed the investigation just enough real information to keep it moving forward and maintain my credibility, while carefully steering it away from anything that would seriously implicate my father or his firm. I identified other targets, built cases against other lawyers and firms, and slowly convinced my supervisors that Korrin, Stradal and Associates was small fish not worth the Bureau's time and resources. It was exhausting, dangerous, and completely illegal. I was risking my career, my freedom, and my integrity to protect people who had never shown me an ounce of respect or appreciation. Every family gathering was an intelligence operation. Every casual conversation with my father was an opportunity to gather information that I could use to stay ahead of the investigation and protect them from consequences they didn't even know were coming, and through it all, they continued to treat me like their personal disappointment. My father would introduce me at social events as our daughter who works for the government, with the kind of dismissive tone usually reserved for discussing someone's embarrassing medical condition. My mother would make pointed comments about how I was still single at 28 and wasting my education on public service. My siblings treated me like the weird cousin at family gatherings, someone to be politely tolerated but never truly included. The breaking point came 6 months ago, when I prevented what would have been a devastating raid on their offices. I'd learned through channels that couldn't be traced back to me that the Bureau was planning to execute search warrants on 3 law firms, including my father's. I managed to delay the operation by raising concerns about the reliability of our informant and suggesting we needed more evidence before moving forward. That night, I called my father from a secure line and told him he needed to clean house immediately. I couldn't be specific about what I knew or how I knew it, but I made it clear that he needed to review all of his client files, dispose of any questionable documents, and make sure his books were absolutely spotless. I expected gratitude, maybe even a moment of recognition for what I was risking to save him. Instead, he accused me of being paranoid and dramatic. He told me I'd been watching too many crime shows and that successful people like him didn't need to worry about government fishing expeditions. He hung up on me after telling me to focus on finding a husband instead of trying to scare him with nonsense about federal agents. 2 weeks later, when the delayed raid finally happened, they found nothing. My father's office was clean as a whistle, his client files perfectly organized and completely legal. The investigation stalled, then quietly died. My father never connected my warning to his narrow escape. As far as he knew, he'd just been lucky. But luck runs out eventually, and mine ran out tonight at Christmas dinner. The final insult came when my grandmother mentioned that she was updating her will and asked each of her grandchildren what they planned to do with their inheritance. Conan talked about expanding his art gallery. Mira discussed her plans for a boutique hotel in Millhaven Bay. When it was my turn, I mentioned that I'd been thinking about early retirement and maybe starting a consulting firm. My father laughed out loud. Consulting about what? Filing government paperwork? Alessandra, you need to be realistic about your qualifications. Not everyone can be successful in the private sector. Some people are just better suited for government work. The condescension in his voice, the casual dismissal of everything I'd accomplished, the complete blindness to what I'd sacrificed for him, finally broke something inside me that couldn't be repaired. When I politely disagreed and mentioned that my experience might be more valuable than he realized, he exploded. That's when he told me I was ungrateful, that I'd never accomplished anything meaningful in my life, that I was an embarrassment to the family name. That's when he said I was delusional if I thought anyone would want my advice about anything. That's when he declared me dead to them. And that's when I realized that I was done protecting people who would never appreciate the protection. I was done sacrificing my integrity for people who had no integrity themselves. I was done being their invisible guardian angel. It was time for them to learn exactly who they'd been taking for granted all these years. The pattern of dismissal and disrespect hadn't started with tonight's Christmas dinner disaster. It had been building for years, a steady accumulation of small cruelties and casual dismissals that had slowly chipped away at whatever family bond we might have had. It started when I was 16 and announced that I wanted to study criminal justice instead of pre-law like my siblings. My father's reaction was immediate and cutting. Criminal justice is for people who can't get into law school, Alessandra. It's a backup plan for students who aren't smart enough for serious academic work. When I pointed out that I had already been accepted to several prestigious universities with full scholarships, he waved my achievements away like they were meaningless. Anyone can get a scholarship these days. It's not the same as earning your way. The dismissals continued through college, where I graduated summa cum laude with degrees in criminal justice and forensic accounting. While my siblings struggled through law school with their gentlemen's C averages, I was earning commendations from professors and internship supervisors. But when I came home for holidays, the conversation always centered around Conan's law review article, or Mira's moot court competition. My academic achievements were met with polite nods and quick subject changes. When I graduated from the FBI Academy at Quantico, finishing second in my class of 47 agents, my family attended the ceremony with expressions of polite boredom. During the reception afterward, my father spent most of his time networking with the parents of other graduates, trying to drum up potential clients for his law firm. When one of my instructors approached him to congratulate him on having such an exceptional daughter, my father's response was, "Well, we always knew she'd find something she was good at eventually." The real pattern of dismissal emerged after I started working. Every family gathering became an exercise in subtle humiliation. At my cousin Julian's wedding, my aunt asked what I did for work. Before I could answer, my father jumped in with, "Alessandra works for the government. She investigates insurance fraud and things like that. Nothing too exciting." When I tried to correct him, explaining that I actually worked on major financial crimes and organized fraud rings, he patted my shoulder condescendingly and said, "Of course, dear. I'm sure your work feels very important to you." At my grandmother's 80th birthday party, the conversation turned to career achievements. Conan had just made junior partner at the family firm, and everyone was celebrating his success. Mira had opened her interior design consultancy and was already booking high-end clients from Thornbrook Heights social circles. When someone asked about my career, my mother sighed dramatically and said, "Alessandra is still with the government. We keep hoping she'll come to her senses and join the family business, but she seems determined to work for bureaucrats." The worst incident happened 2 years ago at Christmas, when my father decided to play a game during dinner, where everyone had to guess which family member was most likely to succeed in different scenarios. When the category was most likely to retire early, everyone immediately said my name, but not because they thought I was financially successful. My father explained to the gathered relatives, "Government workers get those cushy pensions, you know. They can retire at 50 with full benefits, unlike those of us in the private sector who actually have to earn our money." But the pattern wasn't just about my career. It was about everything. When I bought my house in Ashford Commons, a beautiful colonial in one of the city's most desirable neighborhoods, my mother's first comment was, "Well, government loans do make it easier for people to buy houses they couldn't otherwise afford." When I showed up to family events in designer clothes, the assumption was that I was living beyond my means or that I'd gotten lucky at outlet stores. When I dated Marcus, a successful architect, my father spent the entire relationship making jokes about how Marcus was slumming it with a government worker. When that relationship ended, the family narrative was that I'd probably been too demanding or that Marcus had realized he could do better. When I dated Thomas, a fellow federal agent, they dismissed him as another bureaucrat who was probably just as unrealistic about his career prospects as I was. The pattern extended to every aspect of my life. My educational achievements were downplayed, my professional successes were minimized, my personal choices were questioned, and my contributions to family events were taken for granted. I was always the one who arrived early to help set up for gatherings, always the one who stayed late to clean up, always the one who remembered birthdays and anniversaries and made sure cards were sent and gifts were purchased. But I was also always the one whose opinions were dismissed, whose stories were interrupted, whose achievements were met with polite disinterest. At family dinners, I could share news about a major case I'd closed, a commendation I'd received, or a promotion I'd earned, and the conversation would immediately shift to Conan's latest golf game or Mira's newest client. The most painful part was that I had convinced myself that this treatment was normal, that this was just how families worked. I told myself that they were just focused on their own lives, that they didn't mean to be dismissive, that their lack of interest in my career was just because they didn't understand what I did. But deep down, I knew the truth. They weren't dismissive because they didn't understand my work. They were dismissive because they had decided I wasn't worth understanding. They had created a narrative about who I was supposed to be in the family, the underachiever, the disappointment, the one who took the safe government job because I couldn't handle the challenges of the private sector, and they refused to let any evidence to the contrary interfere with that narrative. The breaking point came 6 months ago, but not at a family gathering. It came when I was sitting in my supervisor's office, receiving a commendation for my work on the Meridian Holdings case. Director Chen was explaining to a room full of senior agents how my investigation had uncovered a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme and how my careful work had prevented dozens of investors from losing their life savings. As I sat there listening, to him describe my investigative techniques, my attention to detail, and my ability to build complex financial cases, I realized something that hit me like a physical blow. The person Director Chen was describing, the competent, respected, successful federal agent, was completely different from the person my family saw when they looked at me. And the most devastating part was that both versions were true. I was an exceptional federal agent who had earned the respect of my colleagues and supervisors. I was also the family disappointment who couldn't quite measure up to their expectations. The difference wasn't in who I was, it was in who was doing the looking. That night, I went home to my beautiful house in Ashford Commons, poured myself a glass of wine, and made a decision. I was done trying to earn respect from people who had decided I wasn't worth respecting. I was done protecting people who saw my protection as a sign of weakness rather than strength. I was done being their invisible guardian angel. But I didn't act on that decision immediately. I waited, watching for the right moment, the right provocation, the final insult that would justify what I was about to do. That moment came tonight, at Christmas dinner, when my father looked me in the eye and told me I was dead to them. The morning after Christmas, I woke up in my house in Ashford Commons and made coffee with hands that were perfectly steady. I had slept better than I had, in months, maybe years. There's something liberating about finally stopping the exhausting work of trying to earn love from people who are determined not to give it. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and my secure phone, surrounded by case files that represented 3 years of walking an impossible tightrope, 3 years of protecting people who would never appreciate the protection, 3 years of risking everything for a family that had just told me I was dead to them. Well, if I was dead to them, then my obligations to them had died as well. The first step was the hardest one, psychologically speaking. I opened my secure email and typed a message to Director Chen. Request meeting to discuss conflict of interest disclosure regarding ongoing Meridian Holdings investigation. Available at your convenience. I hesitated for only a moment before hitting send. Once that email left my computer, there would be no going back. While I waited for his response, I began organizing the files I'd accumulated over the past 3 years: bank records, email communications, legal documents, financial transactions, all meticulously copied and organized by someone who had been trained by the FBI to build airtight cases. I had been protecting my family from this evidence, but I had also been collecting it, because good agents always collect evidence, even when they hope they'll never need to use it. The files told a story that would make any federal prosecutor's mouth water. Korrin, Stradal and Associates had been operating in a gray area of legal ethics for years, taking payments from clients who were themselves under federal investigation, providing legal services that came dangerously close to money laundering, and maintaining financial relationships with individuals and organizations that were already on federal watch lists. None of it was dramatic enough for a television show. There were no suitcases full of cash, no midnight meetings in parking garages, no obvious criminal conspiracies, but there were dozens of small violations, hundreds of questionable transactions, and a pattern of behavior that showed a law firm that was more concerned with profits than ethics. More importantly, there were connections. Korrin, Stradal, and Associates had provided legal services to at least 15 companies that were now under federal investigation for various white-collar crimes. They had helped clients structure transactions that allowed them to avoid federal reporting requirements. They had provided legal opinions that gave clients cover for activities that were, at best, ethically questionable. My father wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was something potentially worse from a federal prosecutor's perspective. He was a respectable lawyer who had been helping actual criminals look respectable. He was the kind of person who allowed sophisticated financial crimes to flourish by providing them with a veneer of legal legitimacy. Director Chen's response came within an hour. My office, 9 a.m. tomorrow. Come prepared for full disclosure. That gave me 24 hours to prepare the most important presentation of my career. I spent the morning organizing evidence and the afternoon rehearsing exactly what I was going to say. I needed to be completely honest about what I had done to protect my family, while also being clear about why I was now prepared to stop protecting them. The legal implications for me were serious. I had deliberately steered a federal investigation away from targets who should have been investigated. I had used my position to protect people who were engaged in questionable activities. I had violated FBI protocols, federal ethics rules, and possibly several laws. I could lose my job, my security clearance, and my freedom. But I had also documented everything. Every decision I had made, every piece of evidence I had suppressed, every time I had steered the investigation in a different direction, I had kept detailed records. Partly because that's what good agents do, and partly because I had known that someday I might need to explain my actions. That night, I called my best friend Sarah, another federal agent who worked in cybercrime. I couldn't tell her the specifics of what I was dealing with, but I needed to talk to someone who would understand the weight of what I was about to do. I'm about to make a decision that's going to change everything, I told her. I can't give you details, but I need you to know that if things go badly, it's not because I did anything to hurt innocent people. Alessandra, Sarah said carefully, are you in some kind of trouble? I'm about to be, I admitted. But it's the right kind of trouble, if that makes sense. Do you need a lawyer? I might, but first I need to do the right thing, even if it costs me everything. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. You know I trust your judgment. You're one of the most ethical people I know. Whatever you're dealing with, I know you'll handle it the right way. After I hung up, I spent the rest of the evening writing a detailed memo explaining my actions over the past 3 years. I documented every decision I had made, every piece of evidence I had suppressed or redirected, every conversation I had with my father about cleaning up his business practices. I explained my motivations, acknowledged my violations of FBI protocols, and provided a complete roadmap of the evidence that I had been protecting my family from. By midnight, I had prepared a complete case file against my own family. Bank records, legal documents, financial transactions, email communications, all organized with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that had made me one of the FBI's most effective financial investigators. The same skills I had used to build cases against criminals, I now used to document my family's questionable activities. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 3 years, I had been using my FBI training to protect them. Now I was using that same training to expose them. At 2 a.m., I made one final decision. I opened my laptop and began typing a letter. Dad, Mom, Conan, and Mira. By the time you read this, you will have learned that I work for the FBI and that the Korrin family law firm has been under federal investigation for the past 3 years. What you won't know is that I have been the agent leading that investigation, and that I have spent the past 3 years protecting you from consequences that you never even knew were coming. I have risked my career, my freedom, and my integrity to keep federal agents from raiding your offices, seizing your records, and destroying your reputations. I have steered investigations away from your firm, suppressed evidence that would have implicated you in federal crimes, and violated more FBI protocols than I can count, all to protect people who have spent my entire life treating me like a disappointment. Last night you told me I was dead to you. I was dead. You made it clear that I am not welcome in your family, that my contributions are worthless, and that my presence is an embarrassment to you. Fine. If I'm dead to you, then my protection dies with me. This morning, I will be meeting with my supervisor to provide full disclosure of my conflict of interest in this case and to turn over all evidence I have been suppressing. I will face whatever consequences come from my actions, because I would rather lose my career for doing the right thing than keep it by protecting people who see my sacrifices as signs of weakness. You wanted me gone. Congratulations. You got your wish, but you might want to call your lawyers. The good ones, not the ones who work for your firm. You're going to need them. Alessandra. I printed 4 copies of the letter and addressed 4 envelopes. I would mail them after my meeting with Director Chen, so they would arrive just as the new investigation was beginning. As I sealed the envelopes, I realized that I felt lighter than I had in years. The weight of protecting people who didn't want my protection was finally lifting from my shoulders. Tomorrow I would face the consequences of my actions. I might lose my job, my security clearance, and my freedom. But I would also finally be free of the impossible burden I had been carrying for people who had never appreciated the weight of it. For the first time in 3 years, I was going to sleep, without worrying about protecting the Korrin family from federal investigation, because as of tomorrow morning, they were no longer my problem to solve. Tuesday morning arrived gray and cold, matching my mood as I walked into the FBI's regional office building in downtown Millhaven Bay. I had barely slept, despite feeling lighter than I had in months. The weight of decision was different from the weight of action, and today was the day I would discover exactly what the price of my choices would be. Director Chen's office was on the 7th floor, behind layers of security that I had passed through hundreds of times before, but never with the knowledge that I might not be passing through them much longer. His secretary, Margaret, greeted me with her usual professional smile, but I thought I detected something different in her expression. Maybe I was being paranoid, or maybe word had already started to spread that something significant was happening. "He's waiting for you," she said, gesturing toward the closed door of his inner office. Director Chen was behind his desk, reading through a thick file folder that I suspected contained everything the Bureau knew about my family's law firm. He looked up as I entered, his expression unreadable, but intense. "Sit down, Agent Korrin," he said, his voice carrying the kind of formal tone that he used when something serious was happening. "I've been reviewing the Meridian Holdings file since your email yesterday, and I have some questions." For the next hour, I told him everything. Every decision I had made to protect my family, every piece of evidence I had suppressed, every time I had steered the investigation away from activities that would have implicated Korrin, Stradal, and associates. I handed him the detailed memo I had prepared, along with copies of all the evidence I had been keeping from the investigation. Director Chen listened without interrupting, making occasional notes, but mostly just absorbing the scope of what I was confessing to. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring at the stack of documents I had placed on his desk. "Agent Korrin," he finally said, "you understand that what you've just told me represents multiple violations of federal law, FBI protocols, and your oath as a federal agent?" "Yes, sir." "You understand that I'm obligated to report these violations to the Office of Professional Responsibility and that you could face criminal charges?" "Yes, sir." "And you understand that your security clearance will be immediately suspended pending investigation?" "Yes, sir." He studied me for another long moment. "Why are you telling me this now? What changed?" I had been prepared for this question, but it was still difficult to answer. My family disowned me on Christmas Day. They made it clear that they consider me a disappointment and an embarrassment. I realized that I had been risking everything to protect people who have no respect for me or my sacrifices. Director Chen leaned back in his chair. "So this is revenge?" "No, sir," I said immediately. "This is honesty. I should have disclosed my conflict of interest 3 years ago. I should have recused myself from the case instead of trying to protect them. I'm not doing this to hurt my family. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do, and I should have done it years ago." He was quiet again, then reached for his phone. "Margaret, I need you to get Assistant Director Walsh on the line and set up a meeting with the U.S. Attorney's office for this afternoon. Priority 1. He hung up and looked at me again. "Agent Korrin, you're suspended from duty pending investigation. Turn in your badge and weapon to security on your way out. Don't leave town and don't discuss this case with anyone outside of your attorney." I had expected this, but it still felt like a physical blow when it actually happened. I reached into my jacket and pulled out my badge and service weapon, placing them on his desk with hands that shook only slightly. "Sir, there's one more thing. You should know," I said. "I mailed letters to my family this morning, informing them of the situation. They should receive them this afternoon." Director Chen's eyebrows shot up. "You warned them?" "I gave them full disclosure of what they're facing and advised them to retain counsel. I thought it was the ethical thing to do." For the first time since I'd entered his office, Director Chen almost smiled. "Agent Korrin, you may be the most honest criminal I've ever met." I left the building by 10:30 a.m., no longer a federal agent for the first time in 6 years. I drove home in a daze, my mind struggling to process the magnitude of what had just happened. By the time I reached my house in Ashford Commons, my phone was already ringing. It was Sarah, my friend in cybercrime. "Alessandra, what the hell is happening? I just heard that you've been suspended and that there's an investigation." "I can't talk about it," I said. "But remember what I told you yesterday about doing the right thing? I did it. Do you need anything? Money? A place to stay? A good attorney?" "I might need that attorney recommendation. I'll text you the name of someone good. Alessandra, whatever you did, I know you had good reasons. After Sarah hung up, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee and tried to imagine what was happening at Korrin, Stradal and Associates. The letters wouldn't arrive until this afternoon, but the FBI moved fast when they had a cooperative witness. And 3 years' worth of evidence. I didn't have to wait long to find out. At 1:30 p.m., my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to the message. "This is Mira. I don't know what you've done, but there are FBI agents at the office asking questions about you. Dad wants to know if you've lost your mind. Call me back." At 2:15 p.m., Conan called. "Alessandra, Mom is crying and Dad is screaming about federal agents. What is happening? And why won't you answer your phone?" At 2:45 p.m., my father called directly. His voice was shaking with rage. "I don't know what kind of sick revenge fantasy you're living out, but you need to call off your federal agent friends immediately. This harassment needs to stop now, or I'm calling my lawyer." I didn't return any of the calls. At 3:30 p.m., Margaret from Director Chen's office called me. "Agent Korrin, I wanted to let you know that the U.S. Attorney has authorized search warrants for Korrin, Stradal, and Associates. They're being executed this afternoon." At 4 p.m., I received a text from my cousin Julian. "Turn on Channel 7 News. Your family's law firm is all over television." I turned on the news to see footage of FBI agents carrying boxes of documents out of my father's law firm. The reporter was explaining that the firm was being investigated for possible money laundering and financial crimes. The camera lingered on the gold lettering of Korrin, Stradal, and Associates as agents in windbreakers marked FBI walked past carrying evidence boxes. My phone started ringing continuously. Mira, Conan, my father, my mother, relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, all trying to reach me, all demanding explanations that I couldn't and wouldn't give. At 5 p.m., my doorbell rang. I looked through the peephole and saw a man in an expensive suit carrying a briefcase. When I opened the door, he handed me an envelope. "Alessandra Korrin? I'm Thomas Whitmore from Whitmore & Associates. Your family has retained me to represent their interests in this matter. I have a message from your father." I opened the envelope and read a single line written in my father's handwriting. "Fix this now, or you're not just dead to us, you're dead to everyone." I looked up at the lawyer who was watching me with professional interest. "Please tell Mr. Orion Korrin that his daughter is no longer available to fix his problems. He's going to need to learn how to do that himself." Thomas Whitmore nodded politely. "I'll convey your message. You should know that your family intends to fight these charges vigorously, and they believe you've made a serious mistake that you're going to regret." "Mr. Whitmore," I said, "my family has been underestimating me for 28 years. I'm not surprised they're still doing it now." After he left, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on my back porch, watching the sun set over Millhaven Bay. My phone was still ringing constantly, but I had turned the volume off. Tomorrow, I would need to find a good attorney and prepare for the legal consequences of my actions. I would probably lose my career, possibly my freedom. But for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't worried about protecting people who had never appreciated the protection. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't carrying the weight of the Korrin family's secrets and lies. As I watched the last light fade from the sky, I realized that I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt free. The shockwaves were just beginning, but I was no longer afraid of where they would lead. By Wednesday morning, the story had exploded beyond anything I could have anticipated. What started as a routine FBI investigation into a local law firm had become the biggest scandal to hit Thornbrook Heights in decades. The combination of federal agents, a prominent family, and whispered rumors about inside corruption had created the perfect storm of gossip and speculation that thrives in wealthy suburban communities. I woke up to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. My doorbell had been ringing since 6 a.m., and when I peeked through the curtains, I saw news vans lining Ashford Commons, their satellite dishes reaching toward the gray winter sky like mechanical flowers. Reporters with perfectly styled hair and expensive coats were standing on my sidewalk, speaking earnestly into cameras about the federal investigation that has rocked one of Millhaven Bay's most prestigious legal families. The lead story on Channel 7's morning news was titled "FBI Raids Prominent Law Firm, Federal Agent's Family Under Investigation." The reporter, standing in front of Korrin, Strahdal & Associates, was explaining that sources had confirmed one of the investigating agents was related to the targets of the investigation. They didn't have my name yet, but they had enough details to make it clear that this wasn't just another white-collar crime story. Federal investigators executed search warrants yesterday at the offices of Korrin, Strahdal & Associates, a law firm that has represented some of Millhaven Bay's most influential families and businesses for over 20 years. Sources close to the investigation tell Channel 7 that the case involves possible money laundering and financial fraud, and that one of the FBI agents involved in the investigation has family connections to the firm. The camera cut to footage of my father's office building, where yellow tape still blocked the main entrance. FBI evidence markers were visible through the windows, and security guards stood at every entrance. The building that had been my father's pride and joy, his monument to success and respectability, now looked like a crime scene. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "I'm outside your back door. Let me in before the reporters see me." I slipped through the house and opened the back door to find Sarah standing there with coffee and bagels from Morrison's Bakery, the same place we'd been getting breakfast since our academy days. Thought, "You might need food and moral support," she said, sliding past me into the kitchen. "And maybe someone who knows how to deal with media circus situations." "Is it bad?" I asked, though I already knew the answer from the news vans parked outside. "It's everywhere, Alessandra, not just local news." CNN picked up the story an hour ago. FBI agent exposes own family in federal investigation is trending on social media. Your father's law firm is being called everything from a criminal enterprise to a money laundering front. The story has everything people love: family drama, federal agents, wealthy lawyers, and corruption. I sank into a kitchen chair, suddenly understanding the full scope of what I had unleashed. I knew there would be consequences, but I didn't think it would become national news. Are you having second thoughts? I considered the question seriously. Was I having second thoughts? 3 days ago, I had been a respected federal agent with a pristine career record. Now, I was suspended from duty, under investigation myself, and at the center of a media firestorm that was destroying everything my family had built over 2 decades. No, I said finally. I'm not having second thoughts. I'm just realizing that the truth is messier than I expected it to be. Sarah nodded and poured coffee for both of us. The truth usually is, but that doesn't make it less true. While we were talking, my phone rang with a number I recognized. My grandmother. I hesitated, then answered. Grandmother? Alessandra. Her voice was weak and shaky, older than I remembered. I need you to explain to me what's happening. I've been getting calls all morning from friends asking if it's true that you're the FBI agent who's investigating our family. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of disappointing the one family member who had never dismissed me. It's true, grandmother. I've been leading the investigation into Dad's law firm for 3 years. 3 years. She was quiet for a long moment, and you never said anything. I was trying to protect everyone. I was steering the investigation away from anything that would seriously hurt the family. But after Christmas dinner, after Dad disowned me, I realized I couldn't keep protecting people who don't want my protection. Your father can be a proud fool, she said quietly. But Alessandra, this is going to destroy everything he's built. Everything our family has worked for. Grandmother, what Dad built was built on questionable foundations. The FBI investigation would have happened with or without me. At least this way, I was able to protect you all for as long as I could. And now? Now Dad has to face the consequences of his choices, just like everyone else does. She sighed deeply. I'm too old for this kind of drama. But Alessandra, I want you to know that whatever happens, whatever your father says, you're still my granddaughter. You're still family. After she hung up, I realized I was crying. It was the first time in 3 days that anyone from my family had treated me like I was still part of it. But my grandmother was apparently the exception. By noon, the story had spread through every social circle in Thornbrook Heights, and the reactions were swift and brutal. Sarah showed me the social media posts that were pouring in from people who knew my family. Jennifer Walsh, who had gone to law school with Mira, posted on Instagram, so shocked to learn about the Korrin family situation. Always seemed like such a respectable family. Just shows you never really know people. Marcus Chen, a client of my father's firm, tweeted, If you can't trust your own family lawyer, who can you trust? Korrin scandal. FBI investigation. But the most damaging posts were coming from within Thornbrook Heights itself. The community where my family had been social royalty for 2 decades was turning on them with the swift brutality that only comes from people who feel they've been deceived. Caroline Pemberton, who had hosted my parents at her charity galas for years, posted on Facebook, I am deeply concerned to learn that Korrin, Stradal, and Associates, who have handled legal work for several of my charitable organizations, are under federal investigation. We will be reviewing all of our legal relationships immediately. David Morrison, president of the Thornbrook Heights Country Club, where my father had been a member for 15 years, issued a statement. The club is suspending the membership of any individuals currently under federal investigation pending resolution of legal matters. The Millhaven Bay Business Journal published an article titled Federal investigation rocks legal community that quoted several local attorneys expressing shock and concern about the allegations against Korrin, Stradal, and associates. But what made the article particularly devastating was that it also quoted several former clients of the firm who were now questioning whether their legal advice had been compromised. Robert Sterling, CEO of Sterling Development, told the Journal, "We retained Korrin, Stradal, and Associates for several major transactions over the past 5 years. We're now reviewing all of that work with independent counsel to ensure our business practices remain above reproach." Angela Torres, who had used the firm for her divorce proceedings, said, "I trusted them with some of the most important legal matters of my life. Now I'm wondering if that trust was misplaced. But the most damaging coverage came from an unexpected source: legal bloggers and professional ethics websites that began analyzing the case from the perspective of legal professional responsibility. Within 24 hours of the FBI raid, 3 different legal blogs had published articles questioning how a law firm could operate in the gray areas of money laundering law without attracting regulatory attention. The blog Legal Ethics Today published a piece titled "The Korrin Case: When Family Loyalty Compromises Professional Judgment," that analyzed both my actions and my family's situation from an ethical perspective. The article was surprisingly sympathetic to my position, arguing that I had faced an impossible conflict between family loyalty and professional duty, and that my decision to finally disclose the conflict showed more integrity than continuing to hide it. But the same article was devastating in its analysis of Korrin, Stradal, and Associates. The blogger, who identified himself as a former federal prosecutor, wrote, "The evidence that has been made public suggests a law firm that was systematically pushing the boundaries of legal ethics, taking on clients and cases that should have raised red flags, and providing legal services that came dangerously close to facilitating money laundering. This isn't a case of accidental ethical lapses. This appears to be a pattern of deliberate decisions to prioritize profits over professional responsibility." By Thursday morning, the story had taken on a life of its own. Local news stations were running follow-up stories every hour. Social media was buzzing with speculation and gossip, and legal professional organizations were beginning to comment on the case. The State Bar Association issued a statement. "We are monitoring the federal investigation into Korrin, Stradal, and Associates, and will take appropriate action regarding any ethical violations once the facts have been established through proper legal proceedings." The Federal Bar Association published an article in their newsletter about conflicts of interest in federal investigations, using my case as an example of how complex ethical situations can arise when agents have personal connections to their cases. But perhaps the most telling indicator of how completely the community had turned against my family came from the Thornbrook Heights social scene itself. The annual New Year's Eve gala at the Meridian Club, which my parents had attended every year for the past decade, quietly contacted them to suggest that perhaps they should skip this year's event, given the current circumstances. The Millhaven Bay Chamber of Commerce, where my father had served on the board of directors, held an emergency meeting and voted to suspend his membership pending the outcome of the federal investigation. Even the church where my family had attended services for 15 years began distancing itself. Reverend Williams, who had known my family since I was in high school, issued a carefully worded statement about praying for all involved parties and trusting in the justice system to determine the truth. But he also made it clear that the church would not be taking sides or providing public support for any individuals under investigation. The speed with which my family's social standing collapsed was breathtaking. Within a week of the FBI raid, they had gone from being one of Thornbrook Heights' most respected families to social pariahs that people crossed the street to avoid. But what surprised me was that the community response wasn't uniformly negative. A significant number of people began expressing support for my actions, particularly after the legal ethics blogs began analyzing the case and presenting it as an example of someone choosing professional integrity over family loyalty. Dr. Patricia Hammond, my former professor from the university, sent me a private message. I've been following the news about your situation. I want you to know that what you did took tremendous courage. It's never easy to choose doing the right thing over doing the easy thing, especially when it involves family. Several of my former colleagues from other law enforcement agencies reached out privately to express support. Agent Michael Rodriguez from the DEA wrote, "I've worked with you on joint task forces, and I know the quality of agent you are. Whatever the circumstances that led to this situation, I know you acted with integrity. Even some people from Thornbrook Heights began speaking up in my defense." Margaret Chen, who had known me since high school, posted on Facebook, "I've known Alessandra Korrin for over a decade, and she's one of the most honest, principled people I've ever met. If she made the decision to expose her own family's illegal activities, it's because she believed it was the right thing to do. We should be supporting her courage, not condemning her for it." The validation from people who actually knew me was deeply meaningful, but it also highlighted just how isolated my family had become. They had built their reputation on appearing successful and respectable, but they had never built the kind of genuine relationships that survive scandal and controversy. By the end of the week, the media attention had begun to shift from sensationalism to more serious analysis of the legal and ethical issues involved. The national news coverage was focusing on questions about conflicts of interest in federal investigations, the challenges faced by law enforcement officers who discover corruption in their own families, and the broader issues of professional ethics in high-stakes legal practices. But locally, the story remained intensely personal. My family had become the subject of constant gossip and speculation. People drove by their house in Thornbrook Heights just to see if they were home. Reporters still showed up at their door asking for comments. Their phones rang constantly with calls from former clients, former friends, and former business associates, all wanting explanations that my family couldn't provide. And through it all, they maintained their stubborn refusal to acknowledge any responsibility for the situation they were in. According to the few quotes they had given to reporters, this was all my fault, a vindictive attack by a disturbed daughter who had betrayed her own family for reasons they couldn't understand. But the community was beginning to see through that narrative. People who had known me for years, who had watched me build a successful career in law enforcement, found it hard to believe that I would risk everything just to get revenge on my family. The more my family tried to paint me as vindictive and unstable, the more people began to wonder what I might have discovered that made me willing to sacrifice my career to expose it. The truth, as it always does, was beginning to speak for itself. And as the investigation continued and more evidence became public, it was becoming clear that the Korrin family's problems were much bigger than one daughter's betrayal. They were facing the consequences of 20 years of cutting ethical corners, and no amount of blame shifting or reputation management was going to make those consequences go away. The community that had once celebrated them was now watching their downfall with the same fascination they had once reserved for their success. And I was no longer the family disappointment who couldn't quite measure up to their standards. I was the federal agent who had chosen truth over loyalty, justice over family, and integrity over comfort. And for the first time in my life, that was exactly who I wanted to be. 2 weeks after the media storm began, I received an unexpected phone call that would bring everything full circle. It was my grandmother's attorney, Harrison Blackwell, a man I had known since childhood but had never spoken to in any official capacity. "Alessandra, I'm calling on behalf of your grandmother," he said in his measured professional tone. "She's requested that the entire family attend a meeting at her house this Sunday afternoon. She wants to discuss the current situation and make some decisions about the family's future." "Mr. Blackwell, I'm not sure that's a good idea," I replied. "My family made it clear at Christmas that I'm not welcome anymore." "Your grandmother was very specific about this, Alessandra. She wants everyone there, including you. She said to tell you that this isn't about what your father wants anymore. It's about what she wants, and she's still the head of this family. I had always respected my grandmother's authority, even when I disagreed with her decisions. She was the one person in the family who had never dismissed my achievements or treated my career as a disappointment. If she wanted a family meeting, she had her reasons. "What time on Sunday?" I asked. 2:00. "And Alessandra? Your grandmother asked me to tell you to bring any documentation you think the family should see. She wants complete transparency about what's been happening." Sunday arrived gray and cold, with the kind of persistent drizzle that made everything look dreary and uninviting. As I drove through the familiar streets of Thornbrook Heights toward my grandmother's house, I noticed several news vans still, parked along the route, their crews probably hoping to catch footage of any family members coming or going. My grandmother lived in Whitmore Estate, the grand Victorian house that had been in our family for 3 generations. It was the kind of place that appeared in architectural magazines, with its wraparound porches, stained glass windows, and perfectly manicured gardens. Today, it looked like the setting for a funeral rather than a family reconciliation. I parked in the circular driveway behind my father's Mercedes and Conan's BMW, noting that Mira's car was also there. The whole family gathered together for the first time since Christmas dinner. The irony wasn't lost on me that we were returning to another family gathering to deal with the consequences of the last one. Harrison Blackwell answered the door, his expression professionally neutral, but his eyes kind. "Alessandra, thank you for coming. Your grandmother is in the main parlor with the others." As I walked through the familiar hallways, past family portraits that chronicled 4 generations of Korrins, I could hear voices from the parlor. My father's voice, raised and angry. My mother's voice, pleading and defensive. Conan's voice, bitter and accusatory. They were arguing about me, about the investigation, about whose fault everything was. The conversation stopped abruptly when I appeared in the doorway. My family was arranged around my grandmother's antique furniture, like actors taking their positions for the final scene of a very long, very complicated play. My father sat in his usual chair near the fireplace, his face flushed with anger and something that might have been fear. My mother perched on the edge of the sofa, clutching her purse like a shield. Conan stood by the window, arms crossed, glaring at me with undisguised hostility. Mira sat in the corner, studying her hands and avoiding eye contact with everyone. My grandmother, despite being the smallest person in the room, commanded everyone's attention from her high-backed chair near the head of the room. At 87, she still possessed the kind of presence that made people sit up straighter and speak more carefully when she was around. "Alessandra," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had been making family decisions for 7 decades. "Please sit down. We have things to discuss." I took the only available seat, a straight-backed chair that put me directly across from my father. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the room. 2 weeks ago, he had told me I was dead to them. Now we were facing each other across my grandmother's parlor like adversaries preparing for battle. "Before anyone says anything," my grandmother continued, "I want everyone to understand the ground rules for this conversation. We are going to discuss this situation like adults, without shouting, without accusations, and without walking out of this room until we've reached some understanding about what happens next." She turned to me first. "Alessandra, I want you to explain to your family exactly what you did and why you did it. I want complete honesty, no matter how uncomfortable it makes anyone." I had prepared for this moment, but it was still difficult to begin. Looking directly at my father, I started with the basics. 3 years ago, the FBI opened an investigation into Meridian Holdings for financial fraud. During the course of that investigation, we discovered connections to several other companies, including some that had retained Korrin, Stradal and Associates for legal services. My father's face was already darkening, but my grandmother held up a hand to stop him from interrupting. "The case was assigned to me by coincidence," I continued. "When I saw our family name in the case files, I should have immediately disclosed the conflict of interest and recused myself from the investigation. Instead, I made the decision to stay on the case because I thought I could protect you. Protect us from what? Conan demanded, his voice sharp with sarcasm. From doing our jobs? From running a successful law practice? Protect you from federal charges for money laundering, conspiracy, and violation of federal banking laws, I replied calmly. Dad's firm was providing legal services to clients who were themselves under federal investigation. You were helping structure transactions that avoided federal reporting requirements. You were giving legal opinions that provided cover for activities that were, at best, ethically questionable, and, at worst, criminally fraudulent. The room fell silent except for the sound of rain against the windows. My mother's face had gone pale, and she was gripping her purse so tightly her knuckles were white. That's ridiculous, my father said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. We've always operated within the bounds of legal ethics. We've never done anything criminal. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a folder containing copies of documents I had been keeping from the investigation for 3 years. Dad, you structured a real estate transaction for Coastal Development that allowed them to move $2.3 million through shell companies without triggering federal reporting requirements. You provided legal opinions for Pinnacle Investments that gave them cover to accept payments from clients who were under federal investigation for tax evasion. You helped Sterling Maritime create corporate structures that were designed specifically to hide the true ownership of assets from federal investigators. I spread the documents across my grandmother's coffee table, watching as my family stared at evidence they had never seen before. Bank records, email communications, legal documents, financial transactions, all meticulously organized and documented. None of this is dramatically criminal, I continued. You're not kingpins running a criminal enterprise, but you've been operating in gray areas of legal ethics for years, taking on clients in cases that you knew were questionable because they paid well, and because you convinced yourselves that you weren't technically breaking any laws. My father was studying the documents with the expression of someone seeing his own actions from the outside for the first time. How long have you had all of this? 3 years. I've been collecting evidence and steering the investigation away from anything that would seriously implicate the firm. I've suppressed evidence, redirected investigations, and violated more FBI protocols than I can count, all to protect you from consequences you didn't even know were coming. And then you decided to destroy us instead, Mira said quietly, speaking, for the first time since I had arrived. No, I said firmly. I decided to stop protecting people who made it clear they didn't want my protection. At Christmas dinner, Dad told me I was dead to you all. He made it clear that I was an embarrassment to the family, that my contributions were worthless, and that I was no longer welcome. So I stopped contributing. I stopped protecting you from federal investigation because you told me you didn't want me in your lives anymore. That's not what I meant, my father said, but his voice was weak. That's exactly what you meant, I replied. You've spent my entire adult life treating me like the family disappointment. You've dismissed my achievements, minimized my career, and made it clear that you consider my work meaningless. Well, congratulations, Dad. You finally got what you always said you wanted. You don't have to deal with your disappointing daughter anymore. My grandmother had been listening to this exchange with an expression of growing understanding and, I thought, disappointment in her son. Orion, she said quietly, is what Alessandra saying true? Have you been treating her like a disappointment? Mother, that's not relevant to... Answer the question. My father looked around the room, perhaps hoping for support from my mother or siblings, but found only uncomfortable silence. I never said she was a disappointment. I just thought she could do better than government work. I thought she was settling for less than she was capable of. By better, you mean joining your law firm and doing exactly what you wanted her to do, my grandmother said. It wasn't a question. I thought she would be happier in private practice. Government work doesn't pay well, and there's no real opportunity for advancement. Dad, I interrupted, I make $127,000 a year as a senior special agent. I have federal health benefits, a pension plan, and job security that most private sector employees can only dream about. I own a house in Ashford Commons that's worth more than Conan's condo. I have a career that I find meaningful and challenging, and I'm respected by my colleagues and supervisors. What exactly about my life suggests that I need to do better? The silence that followed was deafening. My family was staring at me like they were seeing me for the first time, and in many ways, they were. For 28 years, they had operated under the assumption that I was the underachiever, the one who had taken the safe, boring government job because I couldn't handle the challenges of the private sector. You never told us any of that, my mother said weakly. You never asked, I replied. You made assumptions about my life and my career, and you were so comfortable with those assumptions that you never bothered to find out if they were actually true. Conan was studying the financial documents spread across the coffee table. How much trouble are we actually in? I looked at him for a long moment, seeing something like genuine concern in his expression for the first time. Honestly? Dad could face federal charges for money laundering and conspiracy. The firm could be shut down and all of its assets seized. You could all be disbarred and face civil liability for malpractice. Best case scenario, you're looking at massive legal fees, professional sanctions, and the complete destruction of your reputations. Worst case scenario, Dad goes to federal prison for 5 to 10 years. My father's face had gone completely white. Can you stop it? Can you make this go away? No, I said firmly. I can't stop it, and I wouldn't if I could. I've already told the FBI everything I know, and I've turned over all the evidence I was suppressing. The investigation is moving forward with or without me. But you could testify on our behalf, my mother suggested desperately. You could explain that we didn't know we were doing anything wrong. I looked at her with something approaching pity. Mom, ignorance of the law isn't a defense, especially for lawyers. And besides, the evidence shows that you did know what you were doing. You just convinced yourselves that it was okay because you weren't technically breaking any specific laws. My grandmother had been watching this exchange with an expression of deep sadness. Orion, she said finally, do you understand what your daughter sacrificed to protect you? Do you understand that she risked her career, her freedom, and her professional integrity to keep you out of federal prison, and you repaid her by telling her she was dead to you? My father couldn't meet her eyes. I didn't know. I never asked her to. You didn't have to ask her, my grandmother said sharply. She did it because she loved you, because she was loyal to this family even when this family wasn't loyal to her. And when she finally stopped protecting you, instead of asking why, instead of trying to understand what had changed, you decided to blame her for your own poor choices. She turned to face me, her expression softer but still serious. Alessandra, what happens now? What do you need from this family going forward? I had been thinking about this question for 2 weeks, ever since the night I walked out of Christmas dinner and called Director Chen. I don't need anything from this family anymore, Grandmother. I've learned that I can't earn respect from people who are determined not to give it. I can't force people to value my contributions if they've decided those contributions don't matter. And I can't protect people who see my protection as a sign of weakness rather than strength. I stood up, gathering the documents from the coffee table and putting them back in my briefcase. I'm going to face whatever legal consequences come from my actions. I'll probably lose my job and my security clearance. I might face criminal charges myself, but I'll face those consequences with my integrity intact, and that's worth more to me than your approval ever was. As I walked toward the door, my grandmother called out, Alessandra, wait. I turned back to face her. I want you to know that I'm proud of you, she said. What you did took tremendous courage. You chose to do the right thing even when it cost you everything, and that's the kind of person I raised you to be. For the second time in 2 weeks, I found myself crying because of something a family member had said to me. But this time, they were tears of gratitude rather than pain. "Thank you, grandmother. That means everything to me." As I walked out of Whitmore Estate for what I knew would probably be the last time, I realized that the confrontation I had been dreading had actually freed me in a way I hadn't expected. For the first time in my life, my family knew exactly who I was and what I had done for them. They could no longer dismiss me as the family disappointment because they had seen the evidence of my competence, my sacrifice, and my integrity. And their opinion of me no longer mattered because I finally understood my own worth. The scared, eager-to-please daughter who had walked into Christmas dinner 2 weeks ago was gone forever. In her place was a woman who knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of, regardless of what anyone else thought about it. I drove home through the rain, no longer carrying the weight of their expectations or their disappointments. For the first time in 28 years, I was completely, authentically free. 1 year later, I stood in the conference room of Blackstone Security Consultants, looking out over the downtown Millhaven Bay skyline as my team prepared for our presentation to a major financial institution. The city looked different from this angle, sharper and more vibrant than it had when I was driving through it in shame and uncertainty 12 months ago. Everything looked different now, including myself. The legal consequences of my actions had been severe but survivable. I spent 4 months in administrative limbo while the Office of Professional Responsibility investigated my conduct. During that time, I lost my security clearance, my FBI career, and faced the real possibility of federal charges for obstruction of justice and violation of federal ethics laws. But something interesting happened during those 4 months of uncertainty. Instead of falling apart, instead of collapsing under the weight of professional disgrace, I discovered that I was stronger than I had ever imagined. Without the constant stress of protecting people who didn't appreciate the protection, without the exhausting work of trying to earn respect from people who were determined not to give it, I found that I had energy and clarity I hadn't felt in years. The final resolution of my case came in the form of a plea agreement that acknowledged both my violations and my cooperation. I pled guilty to obstruction of justice and received 2 years probation, 200 hours of community service, and a permanent ban from federal law enforcement. It was a fair punishment, and I accepted it without complaint. I had broken the law, even if my motivations were understandable, and I was prepared to face the consequences of my choices. But the end of my FBI career wasn't the end of my professional life. It was the beginning of something better. Dr. Patricia Hammond, my former criminal justice professor, had kept in touch throughout my legal troubles. 2 weeks after my plea agreement was finalized, she called with an offer that would change everything. "Alessandra," she said, "I've been following your case, and I have a proposition for you. There's a private security consulting firm here in Millhaven Bay that specializes in financial fraud prevention and corporate security. They're looking for someone with your specific combination of skills, federal investigation experience, financial crime expertise, and an understanding of legal ethics. The owner, Marcus Blackstone, is a former FBI director himself. He's very interested in meeting with you." That meeting led to the best job interview of my life. Marcus Blackstone was a man in his 60s who had spent 30 years with the Bureau before starting his consulting firm. He understood exactly what I had been through, and he was more interested in my competence and integrity than he was in my professional mistakes. "Agent Korrin," he said during our first meeting, "I've read your case file, and I've spoken with Director Chen about your work history. What you did was ethically complicated, but it was also understandable. More importantly, when you realized you couldn't continue compromising your professional integrity, you chose to come forward and accept the consequences. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." Blackstone Security Consultants specialized in helping financially Institutions, law firms, and corporations identify and prevent exactly the kind of activities that had gotten my family into trouble. They provided consulting services on regulatory compliance, internal fraud prevention, and corporate security. It was perfect work for someone with my background, and it paid significantly better than my government salary had. Within 6 months, I was leading my own team of investigators and analysts. Within 9 months, I had brought in 3 major clients and established myself as one of the firm's most valuable consultants. Within a year, Marcus was talking about making me a partner. The work was challenging and meaningful in ways that my FBI career had never been. Instead of building criminal cases after fraud had already occurred, I was helping organizations prevent fraud before it happened. Instead of working within the constraints of federal bureaucracy, I had the flexibility to develop innovative solutions tailored to each client's specific needs. But the most satisfying part of my new career was the respect I received from colleagues and clients who valued my expertise. At Blackstone Security, I wasn't someone's disappointing daughter who had settled for government work. I was a nationally recognized expert in financial crime prevention, someone whose opinion was sought by major corporations and law firms across the region. The contrast with my family's situation couldn't have been starker. While I was building a new career and establishing myself as a respected consultant, they were dealing with the ongoing consequences of the federal investigation that I had finally stopped protecting them from. My father's law firm had been shut down 6 months after the FBI raid. He was ultimately charged with money laundering and conspiracy, pled guilty to reduced charges, and received 3 years probation and a $500,000 fine. He was disbarred and prohibited from practicing law in any jurisdiction. The family's assets were frozen during the investigation, and by the time the legal fees were paid and the fines were satisfied, there wasn't much left. My mother, who had spent 20 years building a social reputation based on her husband's professional success, found herself completely ostracized from Thornbrook Heights society. The country club memberships were gone, the charity board positions were withdrawn, and the social invitations stopped coming. She moved into a small apartment in Riverside Commons and got a job as a paralegal for a personal injury firm. Conan lost his law license as well and was working as a compliance officer for a small insurance company. Mira had managed to avoid professional sanctions, but her interior design business collapsed when her wealthy clients decided they could no longer afford to be associated with the Korrin family name. I learned about their struggles through my grandmother, who remained the only family member I maintained any contact with. She had been disappointed in her son's poor judgment, but she had also been proud of my courage in exposing the truth. We met for lunch once a month, and these conversations kept me informed about my family's situation without requiring me to have any direct contact with them. "Your father asks about you sometimes," she told me during one of our lunches at Morrison's Cafe, the same place where Sarah and I used to get breakfast during our academy days. "I think he's beginning to understand what he lost when he pushed you away." "Is he?" I asked, not particularly interested in my father's belated self-awareness. "He's had to take a job at a small firm in Riverside, doing basic legal research for $40,000 a year. He's finally experiencing what it's like to be dismissed by people who consider themselves more successful than he is. I think it's been educational for him." I nodded politely, but didn't pursue the subject. My father's professional comeuppance was not something I took any pleasure in, but it wasn't something I felt sorry about either. He was experiencing the natural consequences of his choices, just like everyone else. "He's asked me to reach out to you," my grandmother continued. "He wants to apologize, to try to rebuild some kind of relationship with you." I considered this for a moment. "Grandmother, I appreciate that he's had time to reflect on his actions, but I'm not interested in rebuilding a relationship with someone who only apologizes after they've lost the power to hurt me. If Dad had valued me when I was protecting him, when I was sacrificing my professional integrity for his benefit, then his apology might mean something, but apologizing now when he needs my forgiveness more than I need his approval, feels more like manipulation than genuine remorse. My grandmother nodded slowly. You've changed, Alessandra. You're stronger now, more confident, but also less forgiving. I'm not less forgiving, I said. I'm just more selective about who I forgive and why. Forgiveness used to be something I gave automatically to family members, regardless of whether they had earned it or appreciated it. Now, forgiveness is something I give when it serves my own peace of mind, not when it makes other people feel better about their poor choices. The conversation reminded me of how much I had changed over the past year. The person who had sat at Christmas dinner desperate for family approval was gone forever. In her place was someone who understood her own worth, independent of other people's opinions. Someone who had learned that authentic relationships are built on mutual respect rather than family obligation. That understanding had transformed more than just my relationship with my family. It had changed how I approached every relationship in my life. I was no longer the person who automatically said yes to unreasonable requests, who took on other people's problems as my own, who sacrificed my own needs to make others comfortable. With Sarah, who had stood by me throughout the entire investigation and legal proceedings, I had developed a deeper friendship based on genuine mutual support rather than my previous pattern of giving more than I received. She had helped me move into my new downtown condo, had celebrated with me when I got the job at Blackstone Security, and had become the kind of friend who challenges you to be better while accepting who you are. I had also begun dating again, but with a completely different approach than I had used in previous relationships. I was no longer looking for someone to validate my worth or complete my identity. I was looking for someone who could appreciate the strong, independent woman I had become, someone who saw my professional success and personal integrity as attractive qualities rather than threats to their ego. I met David Chen, a corporate attorney, who specialized in regulatory compliance, at a professional conference where I was giving a presentation on fraud prevention strategies. He was intelligent, successful, and confident enough to be genuinely impressed by my expertise rather than intimidated by it. More importantly, he understood the value of choosing integrity over comfort, having made similar difficult ethical choices in his own career. Our relationship developed slowly and naturally, built on shared values and mutual respect, rather than desperate need or family expectations. For the first time in my life, I was with someone who saw my strength as an asset rather than a problem, someone who valued my independence rather than trying to diminish it. As I stood in that conference room at Blackstone Security, preparing to present our recommendations to a client who had sought out our expertise specifically because of my reputation in the field, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 12 months ago, I had been a suspended federal agent facing possible criminal charges and complete professional disgrace. I had lost my career, my security clearance, and most of my family relationships. By any conventional measure, I should have been devastated. Instead, I was thriving, in ways I had never imagined possible. I had a career that challenged and fulfilled me, relationships built on authenticity rather than obligation, and most importantly, I had learned to value myself independent of other people's approval. The presentation went well, as I had known it would. Our client was impressed with our analysis and recommendations, and they signed a 2-year consulting contract that would add significantly to the firm's revenue. As my team celebrated afterward, I realized that this success felt completely different from the achievements of my FBI career. When I had been with the Bureau, my successes always felt slightly hollow because I knew I was compromising my integrity to protect people who didn't appreciate the sacrifice. Every case I closed, every commendation I received was tainted by the knowledge that I was living a lie, that my real loyalty was divided between my professional duties and my family obligations. Now, my successes felt clean and authentic. I was using my skills to help organizations prevent the same kind of ethical lapses that had destroyed my family's law firm. I was building a reputation based on competence and integrity, working with clients who valued my expertise and colleagues who respected my judgment. That evening, I had dinner with David at a restaurant overlooking Millhaven Bay, the same harbor where I had grown up, where my family had built their reputation on appearances and connections. The city lights reflected on the water, and I thought about how different my life looked now compared to a year ago. "You seem different lately," David said as we shared dessert. "More settled, more at peace with yourself." "I think I finally figured out who I am," I replied. For most of my life, I defined myself in relation to other people's expectations. I was the daughter who couldn't quite measure up, the agent who was compromising her integrity, the family member who was trying to earn love from people who had already decided not to give it. Now, I define myself based on my own values and accomplishments. And how does that feel? It feels like freedom. As we walked back to my condo that night, I thought about the Christmas dinner that had changed everything. If someone had told me that night that my father's cruel words would ultimately lead to the best year of my life, I wouldn't have believed them. But sometimes the worst moments create the space for the best transformations. I had learned that family isn't always about blood, that respect can't be earned from people who are determined not to give it, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop enabling people's poor choices. I had learned that my worth isn't determined by other people's opinions, that my integrity is more valuable than other people's approval, and that authentic relationships require mutual respect rather than one-sided sacrifice. Most importantly, I had learned that being dead to people who never truly saw me alive was actually a gift. It freed me to become the person I was meant to be, to build relationships with people who valued my authentic self, and to create a life based on my own values rather than their expectations. Standing on my balcony that night, looking out over the city that had once represented everything I was supposedly failing to achieve, I raised a glass of wine to the woman I had become. To someone who chose truth over comfort, integrity over approval, and authenticity over acceptance. For the first time in my life, I was exactly where I belonged, exactly who I was meant to be. And I had my family's rejection to thank for it. Sometimes the greatest gift people can give you is showing you that you don't need them after all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.